Tom Wilson stood on his front lawn, heart pounding, as Diane Matthews, the HOA board member, waved an official letter in his face. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the late afternoon heat as she threatened him with legal action over the treehouse he had built with his own hands. "You have until tomorrow to take this down, or we will fine you, Wilson." "Big fines," she snapped, her eyes narrowed, full of determination. "You know the rules. The HOA can't allow structures like this. It's a safety hazard and goes against community standards." Tom took a slow breath, trying to keep his composure. His eyes flicked to the treehouse, his pride and joy. Built over the course of the last 2 months, high up in the sturdy oak tree in his backyard, the wooden planks, the ropes, the ladder he'd carefully assembled, it wasn't just a treehouse, it was a piece of his childhood dream. But here was Diane Matthews, demanding its destruction, as if it was some dangerous eyesore. "I'm within my rights, Diane. I've checked the local ordinances. My treehouse doesn't violate any codes," he said, his voice firm, though his hands clenched at his sides. "It's not a permanent structure. It's portable, like a tree swing. You can't just—" "No," she cut him off, stepping forward and pointing at the letter. "It doesn't matter what you think, Wilson. I've already spoken to the sheriff. He'll be here soon to enforce the order. We don't make exceptions for people who think they're above the rules. Not in this neighborhood." Tom felt his pulse quicken. Diane was notorious for pushing the boundaries of her power on the HOA board, and she'd never been a fan of him or his unconventional ideas. But he wasn't backing down, not this time. He had spent enough time researching the local property laws, and he knew she was wrong. This was his property, and he wasn't going to let her or the HOA bully him into tearing down something that brought him peace. "Diane, I don't know what personal vendetta you've got against me, but I'm not taking it down," Tom said, voice calm but resolute. "You're making a mistake." Diane scoffed and turned her back to him, walking to her car as if she had already won. "Fine, suit yourself. Just remember, you'll pay the price for defying the HOA's rules. The sheriff's on his way." Tom stared after her, frustration boiling inside him. But just as Diane reached her car, another voice interrupted the tension. "Is there a problem here, folks?" Tom turned. Sheriff Owens, the local officer, stepped out of his patrol car and gave them both a long, measured look. His gaze didn't land on Tom with the same neutrality he'd once shown him, but with a flicker of judgment that Tom didn't quite understand. The sheriff had always been a good neighbor, someone Tom thought he could trust, but today, his demeanor was different. He seemed to already be siding with Diane, his expression cold. Tom's stomach twisted. He hadn't expected the sheriff to be so quick to take action, but it made sense. The HOA had connections, and they had likely filled the sheriff's ear with their version of the story. It was a classic move, try to intimidate someone, hoping they'd cave under the pressure. But Tom wasn't going to cave. "I'm sorry, Sheriff, but there's no problem," Tom said, taking a step forward. "I've done my research. This treehouse doesn't violate any local building codes or HOA guidelines. It's a temporary structure. I've built it for my son." Sheriff Owens didn't flinch. "The HOA doesn't want it here. Wilson, that's enough for me. We'll have to tear it down." "No," Tom said firmly, his heart racing. "That's not enough. I'm within my rights. You can't just come here." And before Tom could finish, the sheriff raised a hand to silence him. "Look, I'm just doing my job." But Tom wasn't backing down this time. He remembered the legal documents he'd pulled up days ago, pages that outlined exactly what was allowed on his property. "Actually, Sheriff, you're wrong. According to the local ordinance, temporary structures under 25 square feet don't require approval from the HOA, and it's well under that." He pulled out his phone, quickly showing him the section of the law. Sheriff Owens hesitated. The sudden shift in the conversation left him rattled, and for a moment, the coldness in his eyes faded. Diane, watching from her car, stiffened. "I've read the law," Tom continued, "and the HOA can't enforce a restriction on a temporary structure like this one. I've done everything by the book." For the first time, the sheriff looked uncertain. He glanced at Diane, who had gone pale, then back at Tom. The weight of Tom's words hung in the air between them. For a split second, Tom thought the sheriff might back down, but then Diane's voice sliced through the air again. "This isn't over, Wilson," she hissed, her face reddening with rage. "You'll regret this." But Tom, feeling a surge, of relief and newfound confidence, stood his ground. "I think you're the one who's about to regret it." And just like that, the power had shifted. What started as a sure victory for the HOA was now a fight for Furnasand. Tom was no longer the one on the defensive, as Tom Wilson stood outside, still feeling the weight of the confrontation. His mind drifted back to a summer long ago when he was a boy of 12. His father, a skilled contractor, had spent years building homes and working on construction projects. Tom often watched his father labor, learning the craft firsthand. But it wasn't just the work that left an impression. It was the way his father fought for what he believed was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Tom's father, Jack Wilson, was a man who lived by his principles. He was known for standing up against shady business practices, and that same determination passed down to his son. One of Tom's earliest memories was of a courtroom, though not his own. It felt personal. It had been a cold winter, and his father was in the middle of a legal battle with a former business partner who accused him of negligence. The case had been built on lies and twisted facts, but his father refused to back down. He'd lost the case, but it wasn't the loss that left a lasting mark on Tom. It was his father's words after the verdict was handed down. "They can take the money, they can take the house, but they'll never take my dignity," his father had said, his voice firm as he looked Tom in the eyes. "The truth will always find a way to the surface." That moment stayed with Tom for years, shaping his character. He saw how his father had been wronged by the system, but instead of caving under the pressure, he held his ground. It was a lesson in perseverance, one that Tom carried with him into adulthood. Fast forward to his adult life, Tom had faced his own challenges, but nothing compared to the personal stakes of the current fight. Tom's decision to build the treehouse wasn't just an impulse, it was a tribute to the memories he'd shared with his father. His father had died unexpectedly when Tom was in his mid-30s, and the loss had hit him hard. The treehouse, which he'd designed for his son, was a way to honor that part of his childhood and the values his father instilled in him. In many ways, the treehouse symbolized a connection to his roots. It wasn't just about the structure itself, but about creating something that would allow his own son to feel that same sense of pride and legacy. It was a place where his family could make memories together, away from the chaos of life. Tom thought about how much his son Alex had been looking forward to the finished project, excited to climb the rope ladder and look out at the neighborhood from the high vantage point. But this treehouse, the very thing meant to honor family and tradition, was now at the center of an Ulat war with the HOA. And Diane Matthews, who, unbeknownst to many, had her own hidden reasons for targeting Tomoz, a formidable adversary. Her passion for enforcing HOA rules went beyond simply protecting the neighborhood. There was something personal about her vendetta against Tom, something that wasn't immediately obvious to anyone else. She had always disapproved of Tom's free-spirited attitude and his nonconformist ways. But now, with the treehouse, it was clear Diane had found a target in Tom, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. As Tom watched her leave his property earlier that day, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of betrayal. The same fight for justice his father had fought for was now his to continue, and he wasn't going to let it slip away, not now. Not for something as trivial as an HOA regulation. His mind flickered back to that moment, and he realized that he wasn't just fighting for a treehouse. He was fighting for his family's right to live as they saw fit. He was fighting for his son's future and the values he hoped to instill. Diane Matthews represented everything Tom had always despised: them. Oppressive, authoritarian mentality that tried to dictate the lives of others. And yet, despite the weight of it all, there was a flicker of hope. Tom had fought through worse. He had inherited that fighting spirit from his father, and this time, he wasn't going to let the system dictate his life. It wasn't just about the treehouse, it was about standing up for his family's right to build their future, to honor the past, and to protect what was theirs. The fight was just beginning. But Tom Wilson was ready. As Tom delved deeper into his research, he began to uncover more than just legal loopholes and property codes. The more he dug into the HOA's history, the more he started to question their motives. What began as a fight over a treehouse soon spiraled into something much bigger. Diane Matthews, the woman who had been so insistent on destroying his creation, was just a pawn in a much larger gamma game that involved control, power, and something much more personal than Tom had ever imagined. It didn't take long before Tom discovered that the HOA wasn't merely concerned with maintaining aesthetic standards or protecting property values. Beneath the surface, there was a darker agenda at play, one rooted in exclusion and a desire to create a community where only a certain type of homeowner was welcome. Tom's first inkling came when he spoke with his neighbor, Mr. Harris, a retired lawyer who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Over coffee one afternoon, Tom casually mentioned the issues with his treehouse, and that's when Mr. Harris leaned in, his face serious. "You're not the first one to have trouble with that board, Tom," Mr. Harris said, his voice low. "The HOA's been pushing people out for years now. People they don't want here, pushing people out," Tom asked, confused. "What do you mean? Just think about it," Mr. Harris replied. "They're always coming up with new rules, new regulations. It starts small, like with your treehouse, but then they get more aggressive. I've heard stories from other neighbors' people who've been forced to sell their homes. People who had to leave the HOAs always in the background controlling things, manipulating situations to their advantage. It's not just about property values, Tom. It's about creating a neighborhood of perfect people, people they want. Not just anyone who happens to live here." The more Tom thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't about a treehouse. Diane Matthews, with her holier-than-thou attitude and her obsession with rules, wasn't just trying to enforce petty regulations. She was part of a system that thrived on making people conform, on making them feel small if they dared to break the mold. Tom's suspicion grew as he heard more about the HOA's history. They had been involved in numerous disputes over the years, many of which seemed to involve the same underlying issue. Residents who didn't fit the HOA's ideal image of a homeowner. The HOA had a reputation for driving out families who didn't conform to their standards of what was acceptable in the community. Some of the older residents had even whispered about the HOA's obsession with purity, in the neighborhood's desire to keep out certain groups of people based on income, race, and lifestyle. Diane Matthews, it seemed, was more than just a strict enforcer of the rules. She was an active participant in a scheme that wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about control. Tom was furious, and yet a part of him wasn't surprised. He had always felt like the HOA looked down on him, as though he didn't fit in with their pristine version of suburban life. He wasn't the type to spend hours perfecting his lawn or attending every community event. He valued his privacy and the freedom to do as he pleased on his own property. That's what made this fight so personal. Diane wasn't just targeting his treehouse, she was targeting everything he stood for, everything he believed in, but Tom wasn't about to let her win. He knew the HOA's tactics now, and he understood that this battle was about more than just one treehouse. It was about standing up to an oppressive system that sought to control every aspect of his life. In a moment of clarity, Tom realized he wasn't just fighting for the right to keep his treehouse. He was fighting for the very essence of freedom and individuality. He wasn't alone in this struggle either. He had neighbors who shared his concerns. People who had quietly resisted the HOA's overreach, but had never spoken up until now. The more Tom looked into it, the more it became clear. If he could take down Diane Matthews and expose the HOA's hidden agenda, it would send a message to the entire neighborhood. It would show them that they didn't have to live in fear of the HOA's power. And maybe, just maybe, it would open people's eyes to the systemic problems that had been festering in their community for far too long. Tom wasn't just fighting for his treehouse anymore. He was fighting for a neighborhood, for his family, and for the right to live on his own terms. The stakes had been raised, and he wasn't going to back down. Tom's fight to keep his treehouse quickly morphed into a full-blown battle, one that involved not just him, but the entire community. At first, it had been just a legal issue. Simple disagreement between him and Diane Matthews, the HOA enforcer. But as the days passed, he realized that this was no longer about just a tree. It was about his right to exist, as he chose, to live free from the shackles of an oppressive system that dictated what was acceptable in their neighborhood. Diane, after failing to intimidate Tom into taking down the treehouse, had escalated the situation. She began circulating flyers about upcoming HOA audits, a thinly veiled threat that had many neighbors feeling uneasy. In subtle and sometimes overt ways, the HOA was pressuring homeowners to side with them, offering incentives. For those who agreed to support their efforts to eliminate non-compliant structures like Tom's Treehouse, the message was clear: conform or face consequences. It wasn't just about rules. It was about creating a climate of fear. Tom found himself caught in the crossfire of this orchestrated campaign. One evening, as he returned home from work, he noticed that a few of his neighbors had started to keep their distance, averting their eyes when he waved at them. It wasn't lost on him that Diane's tactics were working. People who had once been friendly now avoided any confrontation, likely terrified of being dragged into the HOA's web of control. But Tom wasn't about to let this scare him into submission. He knew that if he gave up now, it wouldn't just be a loss for him, it would be a loss for everyone who was silently suffering under the HOA's iron grip. That night, he began to rally his neighbors. He reached out to people he knew, people who had always been quietly opposed to the HOA's overreach. Some were reluctant to get involved, fearing retribution, but Tom persisted. He reminded them of their rights, of the fact that they had the power to fight back against an unjust system. He didn't want this to be just his battle. He needed it to be a community effort, a collective stand against an oppressive force that sought to dictate their every move. The more Tom spoke to his neighbors, the more he realized just how widespread the problem was. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman down the street, shared her frustrations about the HOA's constant demands that she replace her perfectly functional, albeit slightly worn, front door. The young couple in the house next to hers had been told to repaint their fence to match a new color scheme that no one had agreed upon. It was clear now the HOA wasn't just about enforcing codes, it was about control. They wanted to dictate everything, from the color of your door to the type of treehouse you could build for your children. But as the fight intensified, so did the pressure. Diane was relentless, filing complaint after complaint with the local authorities, each one more baseless than the last. She began visiting local businesses, warning them that they would face scrutiny if they didn't support the HOA's mission. The threat of fines, lawsuits, and social ostracism hung in the air. And Tom could see that she was playing every card in her hand to try to crush him. The HOA also began using more aggressive legal tactics. They started sending threatening letters to Tom, demanding he pay exorbitant fines, while making it clear that if he didn't comply, the next step would be a court order to have the treehouse demolished. But Tom wasn't backing down. Armed with the knowledge of the law and the support of his neighbors, he felt more determined than ever to stand his ground. He knew that the real challenge wasn't just about keeping his treehouse, it was about exposing the HOA's corruption for everyone to see. He began documenting everything, keeping records of every conversation, every complaint, every letter they sent. He contacted a local journalist, hoping to get the story out to the wider community. The more he gathered, the clearer it became that Diane and the HOA weren't just enforcing rules. They were using their power to maintain an unspoken agenda, one that kept people like Tom from living freely. The turning point came when a few brave neighbors, who had stayed quiet up until now, started to speak out. Mr. Harris, the retired lawyer, publicly declared his support for Tom, saying that the HOA's actions were not just overreach, but bordering on harassment. Others followed suit, slowly but surely. The fear that had once held the neighborhood in its grip started to loosen. Replaced by a sense of collective empowerment, Tom realized that this wasn't just a fight for his treehouse anymore. It was a fight for his community, his right to be free of unjust rules. The more he spoke out, the more others were willing to join him. The battle was no longer just about him versus Diane. It was about a community coming together to push back against an unjust system. The stakes were higher than ever, but Tom could feel the tide beginning to turn. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and with each passing day, he grew more confident that they could win this fight not just for the treehouse, but for their right to live on their own terms. As the battle between Tom and the HOA escalated, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had once been silent, fearful of the repercussions from the HOA, started to come forward. The tension in the neighborhood, once thick with fear and isolation, began to crack. replaced by the quiet stirrings of solidarity. Tom's unwavering stand had ignited something in them, something they had been too afraid to voice before. They realized that if Tom could challenge the HOA, then perhaps they could too. Tom knew the importance of rallying his neighbors. This wasn't just his fight, it was theirs. And if they didn't unite, Diane and the HOA would continue their reign of control. Over the following days, Tom started knocking on doors, visiting the people he knew were sympathetic to his cause. The first person he approached was Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who had complained about the HOA's demands to replace her front door. When he told her about the plans to fight the HOA, her eyes brightened with hope. "I've been waiting for someone to stand up," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "They've been making life miserable for all of us. I just didn't know where to start." From there, Tom's momentum grew. He started holding small, informal meetings at his house in the evenings, gathering people who had been directly affected by the HOA's overreach. It wasn't just about tree houses or fences. Anymore, it was about the very freedom to live without constant surveillance and restrictions. One night, a group of 10 people gathered in Tom's living room as he explained his research on the laws and the illegal tactics the HOA had been using. A sense of unity began to build. A neighbor, Michael, a single father, revealed that the HOA had threatened to fine him for having a car parked in his driveway for more than a few hours because it didn't meet their arbitrary guidelines. Michael had parked his car thereafter. A long day at work, too exhausted to park it in the garage. "They're controlling everything down to the smallest thing," Michael said, shaking his head. "I just don't want to live like that anymore." Others shared their stories too. Sandra, the young couple's neighbor, revealed that her family had been forced to repaint their fence a neutral color that wasn't even on the HOA's approved list, a color that wasn't even close to what they had originally chosen. For months, they had been battling the HOA for an approval that was almost never granted. Every story added fuel to the fire, and slowly, the group of supporters began to grow. Tom had started this fight as an individual, but now he was part of something much bigger, something that couldn't be silenced. They had a common enemy, and they weren't going to back down. But not everyone was on board. As the neighborhood started to rally behind Tom, a few residents remained on the sidelines. They were still afraid, too intimidated by the HOA's power to take a stand. One of the more vocal supporters, Karen, had lived in the neighborhood for years and was an outspoken advocate for the HOA's rules. "It's just about keeping things in order," Karen said one afternoon when Tom stopped by to talk. "Without structure, this place would be chaos. You can't just let everyone do whatever they want." Tom's response was measured, but there was a quiet frustration in his voice. "Karen, it's not about chaos, it's about living freely. The HOA, it isn't a government body. It's a group of people using their power to force everyone into conformity, and that's wrong." Karen didn't seem convinced, but her words were tinged with doubt. The first signs of vulnerability creeping in. Tom could sense that the cracks were forming. The tide was shifting, and the more the neighborhood stood together, the more people like Karen would begin to question their loyalty to the HOA. The shift was palpable. One afternoon, a few more people showed up at Tom's door. Hesitant but determined, they had been talking among themselves, and they wanted to help, even if it was just in small ways. The support wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to make a difference. Word spread, and soon. The local news caught wind of the story of a man challenging the power of the HOA in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The media attention only fueled the fire. Diane Matthews and the HOA board were furious. Their control was being questioned, and they responded by ramping up their tactics. They sent out more threatening letters, and some of Tom's neighbors received visits from the HOA's lawyers. The threats were no longer just about a treehouse. They were about quelling this uprising before it spread too far. But Tom wasn't afraid anymore. He knew that the fight wasn't just about him. It was about the principle of living freely. Without an entity like the HOA deciding every aspect of life, the more people supported him, the more powerful the movement became. By the time the HOA attempted to intimidate Tom with legal action, the community was no longer silent. The rallying cry of justice had spread, and Tom realized that this was just the beginning. The people of his neighborhood were no longer living in fear. They were living with a purpose. United in their fight to reclaim their freedom, and for the first time in weeks, Tom felt a sense of hope, knowing that the community was standing by him, ready to take on whatever came next. The HOA had underestimated the strength of the community's resolve. What started as a personal battle over a treehouse had transformed into a showdown that would define the future of their neighborhood. Tom knew that the next step in this fight was crucial. He had spent weeks rallying his neighbors, gathering evidence, and preparing to face the HOA. But now, it wasn't just about saving his treehouse, it was about dismantling the power structure that had been controlling their lives for so long. The showdown came one evening, when Diane Matthews called for an emergency HOA meeting. It was clear that she had sensed the growing opposition and wanted to put an end to it before it escalated further. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the local community center, and Tom knew this was his moment. It wasn't just about his treehouse anymore. It was about every homeowner who had ever been silenced by the HOA's demands. It was about exposing their overreach for everyone to see. Tom had spent hours preparing his case. He knew that Diane and the HOA's board members would come armed with their usual threats, half-truths, and intimidation tactics. But he was ready, armed with legal documents, recordings of past interactions with HOA members, and testimonies from his neighbors. He was ready to fight back when Tom arrived at the community center. The room was already packed. Diane and the other board members were seated at the front, looking smug and confident. But Tom noticed the tension in the air. The board members knew that this time, things were different. The neighborhood wasn't backing down. Tom stood at the front of the room, his back straight and his hands steady. He could feel the weight of his neighbors' eyes on him, and it gave him strength. He began by addressing the board directly, his voice clear and unwavering. "You've been using your power to control this community for far too long," Tom began. "And tonight, we're going to put an end to it." Diane Matthews sneered, but Tom ignored her. He had spent weeks gathering evidence, and now it was time to expose the truth. He pulled out the local zoning laws and highlighted sections that specifically allowed for temporary structures like his treehouse. He pointed to the unfair fines and the disproportionate actions the HOA had taken against him and other residents. The room was silent as Tom laid out the facts, his voice growing stronger with every word. "You're not here to protect this neighborhood. You're here to enforce your own agenda," Tom said. His eyes locked on Diane. "You've harassed families, fined them for things that aren't even in violation of your own rules, and tried to drive people out who didn't fit your vision of the perfect homeowner." As Tom spoke, more and more neighbors stood up to back him. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who had once been too afraid to speak out, rose from her seat, her voice shaking but full of determination. "Had enough of this," she said. "The HOA has been making my life miserable for years. They've told me I have to change my door, my fence, my garden. Enough is enough." I'm standing with Tom. One by one, other neighbors joined in, sharing their own stories of being bullied by the HOA. Michael, the single father whose car had been targeted for parking in his own driveway, spoke up. "They told me I couldn't park my car where I needed to. They made me feel like I was breaking the law just by existing in my own space." I'm with Tom. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The board members looked rattled, their smug expressions replaced by anxiety. For the first time, they were facing real opposition, and they didn't know how to handle it. Diane Matthews tried to regain control of the room, but her voice faltered. "This isn't about you," she said, glaring at Tom. "This is about the rules. The HOA is here too. Protect the value of this community." Tom shook his head, refusing to let her twist the narrative. "No, Diane, this is about control. You're using the rules to enforce your own agenda, to make people conform to your idea of what's acceptable. But that's not what this community is about. We want to live freely, without being told how to live every single day." The room erupted in applause, and Tom felt a surge of pride. The fight was no longer just his on it, was the community's fight. They weren't going to let the HOA dictate their lives anymore. This was their moment. As the meeting continued, the HOA tried to salvage the situation, but it was clear that the tide had turned. Diane and the other board members couldn't argue with the overwhelming support Tom had from the community. They tried to dismiss the evidence, but the truth was out in the open now, and it couldn't be ignored. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Tom and his neighbors had won. Diane and the board members left the community center in defeat, and Tom felt a sense of relief wash over him. The battle wasn't over. There would still be work to do to ensure the HOA's power was curtailed for good. But they had made a powerful statement. For Tom, the victory was sweet. Not only had he saved his treehouse, but he had stood up against a corrupt system, and, in doing so, had united a community. It wasn't just about the treehouse anymore. It was about standing up for the rights of every homeowner who had ever felt powerless. And that, Tom realized, was a victory worth fighting for. The days following the HOA meeting were filled with a sense of accomplishment, but also a quiet realization that the fight wasn't truly over. Tom had won the battle for his treehouse, but in doing so, he had stirred something deeper within the community. The HOA's reign of control had been shaken, but its power hadn't been entirely dismantled. Tom knew that there were still deep-rooted issues in the neighborhood tensions, between those who had supported the fight and those who had remained silent, too afraid to speak out. Tom sat on the porch of his home one late afternoon, the soft rustle of leaves from his treehouse echoing in the breeze. His son Alex was up there, laughing as he swung from the rope ladder, his face lit with the pure joy that only childhood could bring. For the first time in weeks, Tom felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. The treehouse, once a symbol of defiance, was now a symbol of victory, a testament to the power of standing up for what was right. But as he watched Alex play, Tom couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led him to this point. The fight with the HOA had revealed far more than he had expected. It had exposed the cracks in the seemingly perfect suburban life, where every rule was enforced with an iron fist, and the residents, once proud of their peaceful community, were now divided. Many had never questioned the HOA's power, living quietly under its thumb, too afraid to challenge it. Tom had been that way once, but no more. The victory felt hollow at times. He had fought so hard, not just for his treehouse, but for the right to live freely, to make his own choices. But as much as he had won, he knew there was still work to be done. The HOA wasn't going to stop this battle, had only exposed the tip of the iceberg. In the days that followed, Tom began to think about how he could use his newfound influence to bring lasting change to the neighborhood. He couldn't let this victory be the end. He needed to ensure that the HOA's unchecked power never again threatened the peace and autonomy of his community. Tom started by meeting with the residents who had supported him. He wanted to hear their thoughts, their concerns, and their hopes for the future. To his surprise, many of them had been silently waiting for someone to take the lead, just as he had. They had been too afraid to speak out, not knowing how to challenge an institution that had seemed invincible. Now Tom understood that it wasn't just about getting rid of Diane Matthews or the board members. It was about fundamentally changing the way the neighborhood functioned. Together with his supporters, Tom began drafting new proposals rules that would ensure the HOA no longer had absolute control over their lives. They pushed for a more democratic process, one that gave every homeowner a voice in the decisions that impacted their lives. They talked about creating a board that was truly representative of the community, one that didn't prioritize power over the well-being of its residents. In the weeks that followed, Tom's life slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy. The treehouse remained standing, a permanent fixture in his backyard, and Alex continued to spend hours up there, his imagination running wild. But for Tom, the treehouse was no longer just a structure. It was a symbol of his fight, a physical representation of what could be accomplished when a community united for a common cause. One evening, as the sun began to set and Tom sat on the porch with his family, a thought crossed his mind. The victory he had won was not just about protecting his property, it was about challenging the system and realizing that standing up for what was right could change the world around him. The HOA's power had been broken, but it was up to Tom and his neighbors to ensure it stayed that way. The fight was over, but the work had only just begun. And as Tom looked out at the neighborhood, he felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. Future where people didn't have to live in fear of unjust rules and arbitrary power. They had proven that, together, they could overcome even the most oppressive systems. And that, Tom realized, was the real victory.